This is Nobody Cares. I moved to Salmon Arm in 2003, and shortly after I got there, I don't just remember exactly, 2004, it may have been 2005, I broke a tooth on my upper right-hand side, kind of in the middle. So bad news, right? And so I'd had this dentist, and I'd only seen him like maybe once or twice before. And so phone, make an appointment, get in there, and I know this is not good news, right? This is going to be an expensive deal, but it's a tooth that, you can't do without. It has to be fixed. So he checks me out and gives me the bad news. We're going to have to get a new tooth, attach it to the stub of the old tooth that's down there, and then bridge it and whatever, all this stuff, right? And okay, fine. And then he does a little prep work on it, and then we go out, and I pay for the work that he's done that day. And he gives me a statement for the cost of this job that needs to be done. And it was $2,200 and some dollars. I've forgotten exactly. It doesn't matter. $2,250, let's call it. And he also informs me that I need to have a procedure called crown lengthening done, and this has to be done by an orthodontist. And what that is they make an incision in the gum and then draw the gum down a little bit. I don't really know what I'm talking like I know what but that's what they do. And that is so that there's room to, I guess there wasn't enough room on mine. I needed this procedure done to attach the new tooth to that. And so, okay. And he said, we'll contact the orthodontist and then he'll be in touch with you. Yeah, okay, fine. So away I go. And I don't know, a few days go by and the orthodontist, they call. Now, from Kelowna. He's in Kelowna. And so we figure out a time when I can come. I get the appointment. And she informs me that this procedure is going to cost $1,000. I'm a little taken back by that, but what can I do, right? Got to have this done. So, and they need me there at 7:30 in the morning. They want to do this first thing in the morning on this particular day. So that's okay. That's not really an inconvenience to me. I'm always up early, even though it's going to be an hour, more than an hour drive, get down there. So the day comes and I get up and I give myself plenty of time to get there. I always hate to be late. And I'm first one in the chair that morning and get the Major Freeze job, and he goes to work and does all his business, whatever it is he's doing in there. 6 stitches, I know that. And I go to the front and the bill is indeed $1,000. In fact, it's a little bit more than that by the time they get all the taxes and everything in there, but not much more. It's like $1,003 or $1,005. And they give me a little bag of aspirin, and away I go. I'm done. Go home. So some time goes by, and again, this story is a long time ago. I can't tell you what. It doesn't really matter. A week goes by, something like that, maybe 2, and I get a letter from my dentist. And in that, he states that the College of Dentistry or the association or whatever it is, the government, I don't know, I forget, has just had a meeting and they've increased the rates for certain procedures, and that includes the one that I'm having done. And it is now going to cost me $2,400, another $200. So now it's $2,400 and something. Well, that's it. Now I'm pissed off. Now this is too much for me. But I don't fly off the handle. I don't phone them. I just sit and stew about this for a while. I'm really ticked off. I have a signed statement from him stating what the cost is going to be. To me, we've got a deal, okay? Now, it just so happens that I had a trip to Calgary planned. I should say first of all here, that with this crown lengthening, he doesn't want to proceed with the rest of the job until it is completely, totally 100% healed, and then give it an extra few days beyond that. And I think, I had the appointment and it was going to be like 2 months that I had to wait to finish this job off. So I had this trip to Calgary planned, and I get thinking about this, and I'm my old dentist. And so I phone him in Calgary, talk to the receptionist, and ask if I could get an appointment while I'm in town just for a consultation. And it was tough. He was busy, but she does manage to squeeze me in somewhere. And so I go to Calgary and make it to this appointment. And he remembers me, of course, and gets me in the chair. And I tell him what's going on here with my tooth, first of all, so he knows why I'm there. And I kind of tell him the story a little bit. So I get back in the chair, open up my mouth, and he looks in there. And the first thing he says to me is, "Well, you didn't need the crown lengthening." Oh. Well, I'm laying there with my mouth open. I guess I don't say anything. So anyway, he continues. He looks around, pokes around, does his thing. And then, so now I get up, now I get talking to him. And I said, "You're kidding me?" He said, "Oh, no." He said, "There was no need for the crown lengthening." He said, "There's plenty of room on that stub tooth there to attach a..." Oh, I said, "Well, but can you... how much do you want?" So now I'm putting to finish this job off. "You know what I need." He said, "Yeah, I know what you need." He said, "You need the tooth, you need the bridge, you need the blah, blah, whatever, and all this." And so the two of us walk out to the front to his receptionist secretary, and he says to her, "I need a quote for the tooth, the this, the that, and the other." And she opens up her book, and she runs her finger across. "Okay, this is..." and she writes it down on a piece of paper. It's whatever, I don't know, 800, and then this one is this much money, and there's 3 of them, and so, and add them all up, $1,800 to fix my tooth. I book it with him right on the spot, even though I'm living 5 hours away, 5.5 hours away. We'll make this work out. I was going to Calgary fairly regular, and if we can work this out, there's no problem here. So to my doctor in Salmon Arm, "How does this work, buddy? Is this just like a straight kickback, couple $100 in an envelope, or is that too crass for you? Maybe you wait till your buddy and the orthodontist are down in Palm Springs playing golf, and he'll say, 'Okay, I owe you one. You pick the restaurant, and you can pick the wines, and I got the tab.' I firmly believe that what comes around goes around in this world. And so when your balls shrivel up and turn to dust and fall off, you'll know why. And the two of you, you're nothing but human garbage." So I was sitting watching this show, and this is decades ago. Again, most of my stories seem to be. And it was about archaeologists from Great Britain who had been in on the expedition to one of the pyramids, and they had discovered a way to get into these pyramids and they'd found one of these secret tombs. And they excavated that tomb and took the mummies and all the artifacts. And most of that stuff went back to Great Britain to be studied. And so they're going on and on about this. And there was one of the mummies, they knew, I guess from the way, I don't know how they knew, but probably from the way the body was wrapped or how she had been placed. And they knew that it was a woman. And she kind of got left to the end while they looked at everything else. And when they finally did unwrap her, years and years and years later, I've forgotten exactly what they said on the show, and began examining her, they were able to determine that she had terminal bone cancer. Now, this really got my attention. I sat right up and was listening, and maybe I'm the only dummy in the world who thought like this, but for some reason I was under the impression that we had caused cancer ourselves, that it was maybe the product of the Industrial Revolution, that kind of thing. But that's not true. Cancer's been with us since the beginning of time. Well, this is like 3000 BC, so something goes wrong inside our body, in our cells, and it multiplies, and eventually it kills us. And cancer is a normal, natural way to die. When I was a kid, everybody smoked. At least that's the way it seemed to me. Men, women, and people smoked everywhere. You could smoke in theaters, on airplanes, grocery stores, literally everywhere. And so I got wondering about this. And so I looked, I Googled it, and I can't remember now. Did this a couple months ago before I was ready to do this audio clip. And I think it was 1960 I looked at, and their stats were that 50% of the population smoked, and that 60% of those were men and 40% were women. No, it certainly seemed like more than that to me, but let's go with that. Let's go with 50%. The thing that bugs me about this is that back then, nobody had cancer. You didn't hear about it. Maybe, once in a while, very rarely somebody'd hear something like, oh, old Mrs. So-and-so, she's got the cancer. And, somebody else would say, well, how old is she now? Well, she's 84. Oh, well, okay. Now, I need somebody to explain to me why it is that now, and I did look this up, 13% of the population smokes, and cancer is an epidemic. This doesn't add up in my brain. I need somebody to explain this to me. And now, I'm not very smart, but I have a little bit of common sense. And it seems to me that whatever's causing cancer has to be something that's common to all of us. If it's the water or the air, well, we're all in big trouble. But how about food? How about the garbage that we eat now? All these processed foods and GMO foods and growth hormones used on all the cattle and the chickens. That seems to me like is a more likely reason. And that, that gets it started. And then, say, smoking will then exaggerate the cancer. The other thing I refuse to believe is that the sun causes cancer. This makes no sense to me. The sun gives us life. Without the sun, we have no life. And it's the same thing. I think about it the same way now, that it has to be something else that's common to all of us. And then if it's affected your skin in some way or some mole on your body, then the sun exaggerates that and makes it worse or causes it to, mutate or get worse or however you want to say it. The processed foods and GMO foods and growth hormones and all that stuff, that came along quite a bit later in my life. And back when I was a kid, and this would be true for every family that I grew up around, and I'm sure true across the prairies and probably across most of Canada, is that we ate healthy. We didn't realize it. We didn't think like that, but we didn't eat in restaurants. We grew our own food. Everybody had a huge garden. It's just the way it was. There was no growth hormones for the animals. Chickens ran around the yard eating bugs and table scraps. Our milk and butter and cream came from a cow that had spent all day out in the pasture eating grass. Nobody worried about the sun. Everybody worked outside all day long. If you were fair-skinned, you made sure you had a long-sleeve shirt and a hat on. And, none of the tractors or the combine, there was no cabs on any of the equipment to protect you. And so I think that until you can explain to me why it is that cancer was basically, just say, rare back in the 60s and when I was a kid growing up, and that it's an epidemic now, I don't think you should say anything. I used to sleep at the foot of Old Glory and awaken to dawn's early light, but much to my surprise, when I opened my eyes, I was the victim of a great compromise. John Prine. Now, I know nobody's interested in history and nobody wants to hear about the Vietnam War, but give me a chance on this. I think you might be surprised where it goes. And so just going from my memory here, it's a long time ago now, but we were aware of the conflict that was going on over in Vietnam with the North Vietnamese pushing their way south with their communist-backed China. And it became more and more on the news, and the Americans began commenting on it more and more. And then something happened, and they sent some advisors over there. And then something else happened, and they sent a small amount of troops over there for some reason. And then something else happened. And then the next thing you know, the United States was in there right up to their eyeballs. Army, Navy, Air Force, CIA. This war was hugely unpopular, and it went on for years. I've forgotten how long, really. And just the slaughter and the use of Agent Orange and napalm and the bombing spilling over into Cambodia and Laos. And of course, every night we'd have to watch the body bags being unloaded off military aircraft. It wasn't until many years after the war ended, and this was not highly reported, but we found out that the Americans had been in Vietnam 2 years before they sent the troops in, building airports, at least 2 airports. Now, this was done by proxy for the American federal government by private contractors, and obviously complicit with the South Vietnamese. This war was planned. I want you to imagine for a moment this scenario. You've been charged with murder, and you're innocent, but there's a lot of circumstantial evidence, and they're going ahead with the trial, and you need a lawyer. You're in big trouble, and you need a lawyer. Your choices have come down to two people. One is a guy just out of law school, and he's good looking, he's charismatic, he finished at the top of his class, he's outraged, he's ready to go to the ends of the earth for you, and he is fired up and ready to go. Your other choice is an old veteran of the courtroom, and he's nonplussed about this. He knows what to do. He's got you relaxed about it. He said, well, that justice will be done here. I know how to go about this. Well, the choice is pretty easy, isn't it? You're going with the old veteran. You can't afford to take a chance on a rookie and whatever mistakes that he might make. So where I'm going with all this is, and I only heard this articulated once, and I'm pretty sure it was just me by myself, sitting on the tractor doing some field work, listening to the radio, listening to CBC. And it was an interview that they were doing, and this guy was an American. And, I don't just remember exactly how the whole conversation went, of course, but he was talking about World War II ending in 1945, and the Vietnam War starting in approximately 1965. It was somewhere in the mid-60s and ran into the 70s. And his position was that during those 20 years since the end of World War II, that all the leadership in the American military had retired or was getting very close to their retirement age. And the American military needed new leadership, new people to run the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force. When you have the largest army in the world, you cannot have it run by somebody who's read a book about it. You need battle-hardened men to make those tough decisions, those decisions where you're going to send men to their death. You cannot have a rookie who's, like I say, just read a book about it. And that was the reason for the Vietnam War. That's why it was planned, executed, carried out. 55,000 American military personnel lost their lives in Vietnam. Something else I'll mention right here is that there's a best before date on ordnance. I've never yet heard of any recycling program for bombs and bullets. In the early 1990s, Saddam Hussein, leader of Iraq, invaded Kuwait. I don't know why. Maybe there was some history there. I don't remember. Kuwait is certainly very oil rich. This later became known as the Gulf War. And the United States wanted to get involved in that. They didn't like what was happening over there, and oil being very strategic was probably had something to do with that. But there was a lot of apathy in the United States. They did surveys that showed that the American public really had no interest in two Arab countries at war and killing each other. After that, we got along came news of the war, and in particular, Iraqi soldiers, and this I remember very clearly, Iraqi soldiers going into Kuwaiti hospitals and slaughtering the doctors and the nurses and slaughtering the babies as well. It was absolutely horrifying stuff. And after, I don't know how long those kinds of stories were on the news, the American government, did another survey, and they discovered that the American people had begun to take an interest in there and were horrified by what was happening. And that's what got the United States into that war. Now, it was many, many years later that we discovered, and again, these things are never really highly reported. The American federal government hired a top New York ad agency to come up with something to change the American public's opinion. And that was the slaughtering of babies in maternity wards in Kuwait by the Iraqi soldiers. It was completely false. It was made up and presented to the American public to change their minds. Just fucking incredible. A full generation has passed now since what we know as 9/11, that day in New York City, and already it's being talked about less and less. One more generation and it'll be pretty much forgotten about. 2 generations and it will have disappeared into the mists of time. There are so many problems with the government's version of what happened that day that it boggles my mind. First of all, no jets were scrambled, no Air Force jets were scrambled to come and keep an eye on things. There was really no investigation done by the federal government. It was really a poor effort. Jet fuel does not burn hot enough to melt steel. There were skeptical people who managed to get down on site and gather up samples of the dust from the buildings that collapsed. And nanothermite was discovered in those samples. Nanothermite, when ignited or employed, does burn hot enough to melt steel. The plane that was traveling, I think it was from Chicago, the one that had supposedly had all the heroes on it, and the cell phone conversations and what was going on, that's been debunked. It was a Japanese film crew that figured all that out, and it has to do with the cell phone towers and the texts, the inability to actually send texts. And we will actually never know what did happen on that flight. There's a problem with the plane that hit the Pentagon, and it just goes on and on. And actually, for me, it's the collapse of the third tower. That's all I need. I don't even need all the rest of this stuff. And I do remember watching it on 9/11, and it didn't get very much attention. But they just a fire starting on one of the upper floors. This building was 47 stories of extra reinforced steel and concrete. Extra reinforced because it straddled the New York subway system. And this fire burns for, I don't know, a couple hours. They evacuate the building. And I think there's so much going on that day that you're so kind of overwhelmed with everything that's happening. But I do remember it coming down and and I saw this somewhere that it was like 6.5 seconds, the entire building comes down. It just implodes. Controlled demolition, no doubt about it. There's hardly a brick that even hits the sidewalk. There's no reasonable person who sees that could honestly accept the government's version. That doesn't happen. That building could burn for a year and it wouldn't collapse. A survey was done in Europe, and the majority of the people in that survey do not believe the government's version of what happened on 9/11. And the families of the victims from 9/11, more than 50% of them do not believe the government's version of what happened that day. And I do not believe the government's version of what happened that day. There's a privilege that I enjoy, and that privilege is being part of the first generation of Canadians that did not have to face conscription. And I don't really remember actually talking about this with anybody, having a conversation about it. And so I'm not sure how other people feel about it, or if they've ever really thought about it. And certainly generations that have followed me thought about it less and less and less. But probably for me, the fact, the 40 months that I spent down in the United States, where virtually every man that I talked to that was around my age had faced conscription, made me more aware of that. And I don't know just when conscription ended in the United States, but it went on for quite some time. And not just in peace times, the difficulty of having to do that, but certainly when there's a conflict going on, and like the war in Vietnam, which I was prime age for, it does make me consider or wonder just how different my life would have been if I'd been born 200 miles further south. So I have one more little story, and it has to do with the invasion of Iraq by the United States, the illegal, unjustified, unsanctioned invasion of Iraq by the United States. A war that Stephen Harper was screaming his head off that we should be involved with to help out our partners, our friends to the south, the Americans. Unfortunately, John Krachan was prime minister at that time, and he refused to be bullied on that, and that saved us from having to watch the body bags being unloaded off a plane on the evening news. But the story was about David Letterman, late-night host, talk show host, and this was on the eve of the invasion of Iraq. Perhaps not just the exact eve, but it was after it was known that the Americans were going in, and it takes a while to move all the stuff over there and get prepared. And Donald Rumsfeld was the Secretary of Defense for the United States. This is George Bush, Little George I call him. And he was a guest on David Letterman. And so they talked about the war a little bit and went on, and then David Letterman said to him, there's a lot of Americans aren't even really sure where Iraq is. I wonder if you could help us out with that. And he had set this up because he had the globe on the floor beside his chair. And he picked this globe up and handed it to Donald Rumsfeld, the Secretary of Defense for the United States, and asked him if he could show everybody where Iraq was. And Donald Rumsfeld took the globe and stared at it, found generally the right part of the world, but he could not find Iraq. He could not put his finger on where Iraq was. Just incredible. Now, I'm a pretty skeptical guy, and when I look at what's going on with Russia and Ukraine, I can't help but think that here's the third largest military power in the world, Russia, that hasn't been in a conflict, any kind of major conflict, since Afghanistan, which ended sometime in the late 80s. And they just line up on the border and invade Ukraine. No rhyme or reason to it, except that they probably need to now identify the people that are going to lead their military into the future, and it's time to get rid of all the old ordnance before the best before date arrives. And then, of course, on the other side, all the countries that have allied themselves with Ukraine Canada, the United States, Great Britain, Europe, all doing, the same thing. Happy to have a reason to get rid of all their old ordnance before it reaches its best before date. Tens of thousands of lives lost, billions and billions and billions of dollars of property damage, infrastructure damage. Someday it will end. We'll quit talking about it, and then we're going to forget about it. It's just going to drift away into the mist of time, just like every other war.